Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar today on how to develop your cultural competence. My name's Kathy Wellings. I'm the director here at the London School of International Communication, and I'll be handing you over to Heike, who's our expert for today, in just a few minutes. But first of all, I really wanted to thank you for taking the time to join us. Good morning to those of you who are in Brazil, and good evening to people in Asia, and afternoon to those of you who, like me, who are sat in Europe today. It's great to see people from all over the world join us this afternoon, and thank you to those of you who've introduced yourselves via the chat function. I'd just like to start really by saying that I think, this is a subject that certainly we're all very passionate about, and it's great to see so many people showing an interest. It's a huge topic. Unfortunately, we only have just under an hour with you today, so it will be very much a taster session, just showing you some of our insights for today. I am also aware that there are some very experienced people on the call today, but there are also perhaps people with less experience. We are going to try and make it as interactive as possible. We will keep all the microphones muted as there are quite a few people with us today, but I just wanted to show you a couple of ways which you can share comments and feedback and questions and so on. I think most of you have discovered the chat function already. We will allow some time at the end for questions, but if you have any thoughts or questions as we go, please just feel free to type them in there and we'll address them when we can. Just at the very top of your screen, you might see there's a little icon of a person with their hand up. So I'd like to ask you a quick question. Could you raise your hand if you've attended any kind of intercultural training in the past? So you should just be able to click the man. That's it. Lovely. Great. So quite a few people have. If you click that button again, your hand will go back down. And then could I ask people to raise their hand if this is your first experience of intercultural training today, something that's quite new for you? Great, thank you. So just to get a feel for the knowledge and the experience in the room. So what we tend to do on these webinars is, go through some of the core principles and then hopefully give you something that's new, even if you have worked internationally a lot or attended intercultural training. I think there are also some trainers on the call today, so hopefully we can share something with you today as well. The other piece of interaction that you can use is on the left of your screen. You'll see, hopefully there's a toolbar, a vertical toolbar with a T for text and also a pen. So at some point Heike might ask you to annotate or write on the slides. So if you want to have a go there, you're welcome just to test that out and write a couple of words or give us a squiggle just to see how that works. Lovely. There we go. Great. If for any reason that's not working for you, then obviously you can always use the chat as an alternative. Just a couple of other housekeeping things before I hand over to Heike. We are recording the webinar. When we edit the recording, the chat function is removed, so please feel free to ask questions. Don't worry that your name is going to be out on the World Wide Web. It will be removed. So and that will go out to you in the next couple of days, and then obviously you're welcome to share that recording with any colleagues who've missed the session this afternoon. So I'm going to stop talking now and hand over to Heike Saxe-Taylor, who I've worked with for many, many years. Heike's a German national, but been working here in the UK and very internationally for the last 15 years, I think, but Heike will correct me if I'm wrong. She's also an executive coach as well as an intercultural management trainer. So I'm very, very happy to hand over to Heike and let her share some of her, at least, breadth of experience with you today. So enjoy the session, and I'll be back at the end just to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kathy. Hello and welcome everybody. I hope you can hear me and you can see me well wherever you are in the world. I can see we've got people in Brazil, we've got people in China, people from all over the world. So um, really good to have you all on the course. So, what are we going to talk about over the next 45 minutes or so? Title today is How to Develop Your Cultural Competence. So, that's what we're doing today. So, let me share with you what that is all about and what we have prepared for you. So, in terms of the objectives for this short session, I think we're trying to gain an understanding of what cultural competence actually is. Will hopefully help you a little bit with just gaining some cultural self awareness. We'll provide you with some tips on how to communicate across cultures, and we will just dip into some of the essential skills required for working across cultures and give you some insights into those. As Kathy said, we'll try and keep it as interactive as possible. So use all those tools that Kathy has described, and then hopefully we can turn this into a really interesting session. Okay, um, so Kathy asked you before um, who's already had some intercultural training and who hasn't. And we saw some people have got some experience, others are completely brand new to this. So apologies to those who are more experienced. I think we need to just have a quick look at some of the very basics in this area. So before we can even talk about cultural competence, I think we need to just have a quick look at what culture actually is. So what is that? Any ideas? What is culture? What do you think? If you have any ideas, please type it into the chat box. Okay, some people are typing already. Let's just collect some ideas. Multiple attendees typing, that's brilliant. Okay, so we have a way of life. We have social norms dependent on geography, a group that share values, norms, assumptions, and beliefs. Brilliant. Those are all very valid points. So let me just share a couple of other definitions of culture with you. So many of you will be familiar with this one here. This is good old Hofstede, collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes the members of one group of people from another. So I think many of us will be familiar with that. And I think that's quite an interesting concept to think of collective programming of the mind. Maybe it sounds a bit static, but there's certainly something of value that we can take away from this. Another one is the one by Trompenas and Hampton Turner. Culture is the way in which a group of people solves problems and reconciles dilemmas. So really, when things get tough, that's when we find out about people's culture. Um, and then another one, which goes back a very long way to Edward T. Hall, an anthropologist who worked in this area back in the 60s. And we still use a lot of his concepts in intercultural theory today, such as low context and high context and so on. Some of you might be familiar with that. And he talks about culture being man's medium. There is not one aspect of human life that is not touched and altered by culture. So, a very, very broad definition, which encapsulates all sorts of different aspects of what culture actually is. So, let me share with you a few definitions of what cultural competence actually is. So, um, in their really good book, Intercultural Interaction, by Helen Spencer Oatey and Peter Franklin, they describe cultural competence as you can see here. It is the competence not only to communicate verbally and non-verbally and behave effectively and appropriately with people from other cultural groups, but also to handle the psychological demands and dynamic outcomes that result from such interchanges. So very dense, a lot in there in that definition, but we can see there's something here about behaviors, there's something here about skills, And also, if we look at psychological demands and so on, that's to do with how we approach intercultural interaction, what sort of attitudes we display. So, putting it a little bit more simply, a lot of the research into cultural competence distinguishes between knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Or others speak of cognitive, behavioral, and affective competencies. And you can sort of see those three areas reflected in that as well. So, knowledge, of course, that's an absolutely huge area. If you are moving to a certain country, if you're part of a company which is going through a merger, say, with a company from a different country, if you're working in an international team, there is an awful lot of knowledge to acquire about specific cultures. And you can read lots of books, find a lot of resources online. You can attend training courses to acquire knowledge about certain cultures. Um, so that's a huge area which will probably never end. I have now lived in the UK for a good 20 years, and there's still things I'm learning. There's still stuff I didn't know. So whenever I do an intercultural training session with British people, I always take something new away from that. So the knowledge never ends and is an absolutely crucial part of cultural competence. But we've also got skills that we need to acquire and develop. So let's have a little bit more of a look um, at that because that's pretty much what today is all about. So if you please could use the text tool. So if you look at the toolbar, there's just a big capital T there. So that you can use to write onto this slide. So if you can think of certain attitudes, which would be really helpful for working across cultures, and if you think of certain skills that we all need to have to do this, please write them in there. Okay, so we've got open-minded, absolutely very, very important to keep an open mind, and flexibility, I guess that is that right? Yeah, very good. Absolutely. So not to insist on a certain way of doing it, something, a certain way of running a meeting, but to say, okay, let's do it this way, let's try that, let's do it your way. That flexibility, absolutely crucial. Yeah, the willingness to learn. Yeah, not to say, well, this is the way we've always done it. No way are we going to change that. Curiosity, yes, absolutely crucial. And that's also something that makes this really fun and enriching, isn't it? To have that curiosity satisfied, to learn a lot about other cultures. Hardworking, absolutely. Yes, sensitivity, intuition, being able to put yourself into that other person's shoes. How are they feeling at the moment? How does all this land with them? Empathy plays into that a little bit as well. So, really tuning into the other person. Resilience, absolutely crucial. Goes to a certain extent also with being emotionally resilient. So, not taking things too personally immediately, not reacting in an overly emotional way. That also links in with emotional intelligence. Okay, so acceptance, positivity, yes, assuming positive intentions as well on the part of the people you are dealing with. I sometimes, especially in my coaching work, come across people whose basic mode is to be extremely skeptical, quite defensive. That's not a helpful attitude if you're thinking about working across cultures. So positivity, assuming positive intent, absolutely crucial. Um, okay, I'm just seeing here from somebody that they cannot hear me very well. Is that the same with others? So I'll try and just move this a little bit better now. Okay, I'll try and just keep my microphone a bit closer to my mouth. Good, great. Let's have a look at the skills. So here we have Mediation skills, yes. Negotiation skills, and if you particularly are able to adapt those to working across cultures, because if you've learned this specifically for your own culture only, then no doubt there will be something to add to that to slightly adapt to make this successful across cultures. Language skills, yes, extremely helpful. Even if you can just say a few words in the language of your colleague, your partner, your client, that can be very, very helpful. If you properly learn the language, brilliant. Observation skills, yes, just listening, observing, very, very important to be able to do that. Patience, yeah, very good. Empathy, adaptability, listening skills, and communication skills. So I would think as listening, all of these are absolutely crucial when it comes to working across cultures and developing your cultural competence. So great, thank you very much for that. And as you will see on my next slide, a lot of this is on here as well, a lot of those ideas that you have come up with there. So you will recognize a lot of this here, maybe just assuming positive intent, flexibility, adaptability, resilience, and a non-emotional approach. In terms of skills, what we've added here is the ability to analyze a situation, and we will show you a couple of tools which can be useful for that. We will look at communication skills. Building relationships is important. International leadership and working in an international team, all those are really important skills to develop as part of your um, intercultural competence. So let's have a look at this first area that we've got here under attitudes, which is all to do with self-awareness. So what do you think makes us who we are? What makes some of you British? What makes some of you Taiwanese? What makes you Brazilian? What makes me German? What sort of factors have influenced us in all that? Again, please use the chat box to just let me know any ideas that you might have on this. What makes you who you are? Yeah, our experiences. If you could please use the chat box, because we are going to put lots of stuff onto the slide in a minute. Yeah, this family life, upbringing, very true. History, values. Yeah, values crucial. Education, experiences, the school environment. Yep, the outlook on life, your beliefs. Please use the chat box. Religion, yes. Yep. Cultural identity, history, religion again, the values again. Brilliant. So many different factors which have an influence on who we are. And of course, we are not just a certain nationality. We're also many other things like a certain personality, a certain age, gender, and so on. But at the moment, we're just trying to look at that cultural component of who we are. Mm-hmm. Our worldview is defined by knowledge and experience. Brilliant. So let's summarize all that a little bit. So on this slide here, we've got many of the elements which you have mentioned. So family, absolutely crucial. The things that your parents say to you when you're a toddler or a small child, they will stay with you for the rest of your life. Your education, we're all very aware of the fact that education systems the world over transmit different values, different ways of learning, which then feed into how we work. What level of direction do we require at work, for example? How empowered do we feel? Religion is crucial even if you are in a country where overtly it doesn't play such an enormous role, but it might still be there in the morality uh, that we take for granted in that country. History, absolutely. Geography. Are you isolated somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, such as New Zealand, for example, or are you in the middle of Europe, in the middle of Africa, in the middle of South America? With lots of land borders with other countries. Your workplace, what was it like when you first started work? How did people treat with each other? How did your boss behave? What was it like to work in a team? All these things will have shaped us and our idea of working with others. What stories do the media tell us in our country? There are clear narratives there which are specific. The basic values and beliefs, things such as truth, honesty, tolerance, integrity, and so on, they will have shaped us. What are accepted behaviors? Um, do we all shake hands? Do we look at each other? Do we queue when we're trying to get to a counter, to in the airport, wherever? All these sort of behaviors that we take for granted and which we then find strange or even object to if we see something different from people in other cultures. What sort of cultural narratives do we have in our country? If you, for example, at the moment, look at the US elections and you hear phrases repeated all the time like making America great again, or people talking about the greatest country on earth, there is a sort of slightly worrying implication in there as to how do you then, if that's your narrative, how do you view people from other countries? Are they not as great? There are some similarities, for example, with the whole Brexit debate that we've just had in the UK, where the country has now, by a narrow margin, voted to leave the European Union. And a lot of the narrative there was about the great in Great Britain, about taking back control, about a slight sense of superiority. So every country has these sorts of narratives, these ideas about themselves. And I think we need to just take a look at all of these aspects, reflect on how they shape our expectations, our views of ourselves, and also the views that we take of others, because that will be at the back of our mind when we interact with others. So we could talk about this all day, but this is just for a little bit of background at the moment. So let me show you quite a funny photo to finish this. Um, so this on the subject of queuing, I just mentioned this. This is a ski lift somewhere in the European Alps, and loads of young people trying to get onto this lift. And there's no sign, not a trace of any attempt to queue. It's just all in there, all trying to get on it once. Now, if you're from a culture like the one I'm living in at the moment in the UK, I think a lot of people would be really appalled by this and would hope that people would form an orderly queue. So if you go skiing and you see some people from Britain who've never been skiing before, at the first day of the skiing holiday, they get pushed to the back. Sooner or later, they start muscling in like everybody else. But the expectation of a British person when it comes to queuing is that you respect the queue and you keep in line. And people can be quite upset when that doesn't happen. So that's just a quick example of an accepted behavior. Okay, so much on this whole topic of self-awareness. So before we look more at skills, let's have a really practical example in the background. So let's just assume that you are in the marketing department of a company with subsidiaries all over Europe. And your team has just devised a marketing strategy for a new project. And as the first country to roll this out, and you go to Germany to introduce this. I'm taking Germany because then you can let loose, I can take it. You have a 1 hour meeting with senior management and the marketing team. And this is what happens. So you're giving a high-level 20-minute presentation, leaving plenty of time for brainstorming, which is something you're really familiar with, you really like. But the people in the room seem a little bit reluctant to join in this activity. Then the managing director asks you a number of really direct and probing questions. You feel quite under pressure, all these sort of very detailed, very direct questions. The marketing manager wants to know the long-term plans for this product. Before engaging, what are the really long-term plans for this? And there is a very heated discussion between some participants, which sounds rather confrontational to you. They seem to be really quite cross with each other. And when the hour is up, you've not quite finished, but several participants are just leaving the room, although the meeting hasn't finished. So what's going on? You're not really sure what to make of all this. So think about this for a moment. Um, Against your own cultural background, how you would normally interpret a situation like this, what do you think is going on here? So please use the chat window to just describe to me what you think is going on here. Yeah, I didn't reach my target, so I guess you mean you didn't manage to convince them of your new strategy. Yep, they might find the new marketing strategy is not workable. Okay, so they just don't like your idea. There are issues going on in the background which you are not aware of. And these have been brought to the meeting unfairly. Okay, so a whole agenda that's going on. Perhaps they do not see me as part of the team. Yeah, Pfizer, the expectations of the meeting may not have been managed properly. They may not have been prepared to hear about a new strategy and know to brainstorm and prepare ideas. Yep, maybe there was a lack of objective. Presenter hasn't taken account of any of the cultural norms in the German environment. Without an understanding on how the team expected to receive the information, it is unlikely to be put across in a way they will react to. Lack of preparation, probably mistake on the overall presentation. Okay, good. So we have a whole lot of different aspects, ideas, input on why this situation has played out in the way that it has. So if you come across a situation like this, you're finding yourself in an international setting, you have behaved in a certain way, which to you seemed the obvious thing to do, how you feel comfortable to work, but the reactions that you're getting around you are not what you expected. So you're a bit uncertain as to what has actually happened. There are a couple of tools which you can use in order to interpret a situation like that. And I'll show you these two tools. Hopefully you will find them helpful. The first one is the so-called ladder of inference. So this goes through a number of really important steps for assessing a situation. So starting at the very bottom, there is our reality. There are the facts. Here is what actually happened, what you have been able to see and to hear. The next step up, is the selected reality. So quite often we only choose to perceive a part of what is around us. There are other things which we totally ignore because we've probably already got some ready-made ideas in our head, so we're selecting from reality. We are then interpreting that reality. Oh, I know what that means. Oh, yeah, I've seen this before. This is clear. Based on that, we then make certain assumptions. Oh, yeah, they were probably not very happy, or yeah, something along those lines. On the basis of that, we then reach certain conclusions. Okay, this is not going to work. This strategy will not be accepted in Germany. On the basis of that, we might then even develop some beliefs, such as selling anything, any new strategy to the German subsidiary is actually really hard. We might then even move on to actions such as, well, we'll leave them to the very end next time. We'll start with other countries, which are maybe a little bit easier to deal with. So, dangerous steps along the way, which you could be taking. So if we now take one of the conclusions that you came up with, such as you haven't reached your target, you haven't reached your goal, so basically saying they they don't like the strategy, I haven't reached my goal. I would say that's probably a conclusion. Yeah, that's a conclusion that you have reached. Now, in order to test that conclusion, it is then really useful to work your way back down that ladder of inference. So your conclusion is, didn't reach my target, haven't been able to do what I wanted to do. So what's that based on? So what am I assuming here? Is it that because of a certain way of communicating, I'm actually assuming that people are not happy, don't agree with me? Is that because I'm testing the communication style according to my own standards, my own assumptions? Um, what sort of interpretations am I basing this on? So some people left the room. What does that mean to me? In my own culture, that's probably a real sign of, oh, not interested, don't want to spend any time here. But is that actually correct? Are there maybe cultural factors in the background, such as people wanting to not be late for the next meeting, which are pretty neutral and don't actually express a value judgment on my strategy? Which bits of reality have I selected to focus on, such as, for example, the fact that some people left the room, um, the fact that some people talk to me very directly, very sternly. Um, is that the whole reality? Are there other facts that I should be taken into consideration? Such as, for example, the fact that many people did actually actively engage with me. So within the German culture, that's probably a pretty good sign. Um, have I taken into account the fact that there is usually a pretty direct communication style in Germany? Not always, but there's a preference for that. Punctuality is important, so people don't want to miss the next meeting, and so on. So by using this ladder of inference, you can test your conclusions and your assumptions and just make sure you've had the whole picture of what's actually really going on. Another tool that you can use here, which is very useful, is the dive model. And those of you who are more experienced in intercultural matters might well have come across this before. So dive stands for describe, interpret, verify, and evaluate. So if we're describing what is actually going on here, then we're focusing on the facts. We're describing how many people are there, what we've seen, what we've heard, what actually happened. Once we've done that in as detailed a fashion as possible, really trying to not select our reality, but to describe everything that's going on, we then can move on to interpreting. So, what are the possible explanations for what we have just experienced? What could be the reasons behind the behaviors? What could be the meaning of that? So it's quite a good idea to sort of come up with 2, 3 different um, variations of that, 2, 3 different explanations. Then you go on to a step which we call verify. And this is where your knowledge about a certain culture comes in. So this is where you could either hopefully refer to your own knowledge that you've acquired about cultures, or if you haven't got that depth of knowledge, talk to a colleague who's got a lot of experience working with that country. Go to all sorts of resources which are available. Um, so look at cultural concepts, look at descriptions of communication style in that particular country. So this is where you might then come across the fact that the preference in communication style in Germany is for a more direct one. There's a preference for more long-term planning, wanting to have lots of facts and data and so on. There is this preference for punctuality, and I'm not trying not to generalize too much here, but there is a preference for having to be on time for the next meeting and so on. And once you have gathered all that information and verified what you have observed before, you can then re-evaluate the whole situation. So what do you feel like now? Have you actually gone through these different steps? Are you actually at the point where you think now, nobody's passed judgment here yet. Everything is still completely open. I can take it from here and just ask more questions, work constructively with these people, and very probably you will be moving on to a constructive discussion of your strategy because you have evaluated correctly all those ideas that you had in your mind about failure, about not having achieved your target, and so on. You have realized through the dive model or the ladder of inference that you were jumping to conclusions and making assumptions which were not really based in reality. So these are just a couple of tools which can be very, very useful in this sort of situation where you're not quite sure what's going on. So you're interpreting according to your own cultural expectations, norms, and preferences, but in fact, there's clearly something else going on. So these could be really useful to use in those situations. Good. Another really, really important skill when we're talking about cultural competence is, of course, the whole area of communication. So our communication skills. So what actually happens when we communicate? So here you are the sender. You are encoding, formulating, shaping a message, which you are sending across to the receiver of that message, who will decode that message and interpret it. Somebody very clever once said, you don't actually know what you've said until you know how it has landed with the other person. I think that's really, really true, and there's a lot in that. You are choosing your mode of delivery. So you might be doing this face to face, you might be doing this by email, on the phone, telephone conference, social media, all sorts of different modes of delivery. And then as your message is transmitted, there are all sorts of different options of interference, of things which could happen to your message, filters that your message goes through, which could mean that it doesn't land quite as you wanted it to. The meaning has somehow been changed on the way across from the sender to the receiver. So, any ideas what sort of factors could interfere with your message? Maybe in the chat box. Yeah. There's the whole big area of unconscious bias, massive big area of research that we all have certain assumptions in our heads that might not necessarily be to do with reality. Yeah, could just be the fact that somebody's in a grumpy mood and the way the message lands is a lot stronger, a lot more aggressive than they actually intended it to be. Language, exactly. So somebody has said something in a foreign language, maybe, and they've chosen slightly the wrong tone, slightly the wrong wording, and it comes across with totally different uh, meaning. Yeah. And of course, culture is an important part of this. So, linguistic expectations about um, how fast you say something, about the tone of voice, and so on. Customs, communication style. Are you a direct communicator or more indirect communicator or somewhere in the middle? So, all sorts of different factors can interfere with the way your message comes across. So, what we need here clearly are communication skills. So, let's have a quick look at this slide here. There are a whole range of different communication skills here. We'll go through them in a minute. But before we do that, I would like you to just choose the two which you think are the most important and do a quick tick in the box behind those options. So the first one is speaking slowly and clearly. Next one is speaking loudly. Next one is active listening, asking questions, ensuring understanding through summarizing and mirroring, adapting your style to cultural preferences of others, tuning into non-verbal communication. So let's see, which ones do you think are the most important? Great. Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Yes. Great. Very good. Good. So you clearly think that active listening is really important, that ensuring understanding through summarizing and mirroring are important, and tuning into non-verbal communication, absolutely crucial, and also adapting your style to the preferences of others. Very good. Let's have a quick look through these. So some languages just have an incredible pace to them. Um, so, for example, when it comes to English, there are some regions where English is spoken very, very quickly. And if you are not a native speaker, then it's really, really hard to tune into that. A lot of the Mediterranean languages, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, very fast, usually in their delivery. So, again, for somebody who's not a native speaker but who has just learned this language somewhere along the way, very hard to really hook into that. It's just sort of a noise that goes past, and really getting a hook into that can be quite hard. So if the native speaker can manage to speak slowly and clearly, that is really, really important. I'm really glad to see that nobody ticked speaking loudly. That's just a red herring I put in here. Certainly in the UK, that's sort of very antiquated belief. If they don't understand you, just speak more loudly. So really glad that nobody has ticked that, because that of course doesn't help at all. Active listening, absolutely crucial. So really engaging with that person, showing through your body language that you are listening, asking questions, um, making sure you're really listening rather than formulating your reply already in your head. So all those active listening skills absolutely crucial when we're communicating across cultures. Summarizing and mirroring. Yeah, so you come to the end of a certain section on something and you say, if I can just summarize what we've agreed here, we have decided to go for this option, um, or mirroring. So if I can just, if I can summarize what you are telling me, you would prefer us to spend a bit more time preferring this, exploring this option. So summarizing, mirroring, open and closed questions, really, really important. Then a slight adaptation of your own style to the cultural preferences of others. Very important, very useful. Of course, you're not suddenly changing how you communicate completely, but sort of a slight adaptation of, say, 10-15% could be very, very useful. So if you are dealing with a very indirect communicator and you come from a more direct communication style, then toning things down a little bit, being slightly more um, polite, cautious about the way you express certain statements could be really important. And tuning into nonverbal communication. If somebody looks confused, then they probably are. So as nonverbal communication is such a huge part of what communication altogether is about, lots of different bits of research into this, lots of different statistics, but I think it's safe to say that nonverbal communication is actually the bigger part of communication. So really tuning into that, absolutely crucial. So as we're talking about cultural competence, about communicating across cultures, I think it's worth exploring a little bit this area of communication between native and non-native speakers. So if you are a native speaker and you are communicating with people from different cultures whose native languages are different from your own, what do you think would be really good practice for a native speaker? What would be very, very helpful? Any ideas? If you do have some ideas, please put them into the chat box. Several people typing. I like to see that. Yeah, simplify your language. Mm-hmm. Speak slowly and use simpler words. Very true. Yeah, choose words that are not hard to understand. Mm-hmm. Try to learn about the other's culture, yes. Use short sentences. Yeah. Do you not use idioms or regional expressions? Yeah, using different words to explain. So rather than just saying the same thing again, actually reformulate it slightly, because clearly the words that you used before didn't come across. Allow space for comprehension. Yeah, pausing from time to time rather than just rattling on. Simplifying, absolutely. Yeah, explaining the same thing differently. These idioms can be so culturally specific. So in British English, for example, there's a whole host of idioms all to do with sports, with rugby, with cricket, with tennis, and so on, which other cultures who are not familiar with those sports, of course, couldn't even understand, such as hitting someone for six, or being stumped and so on, all cricket stuff that nobody else would understand. So just to go through this, keeping it clear and simple, as you said, making space for people. Yes, you formulated that very nicely, Steve, allowing space for comprehension. Yeah, so that's a nice way of putting it, but also space in terms of letting other people into the conversation, because as a non-native speaker, you might be really struggling to get a word in edgeways, to even get to say anything, because the stream of conversation is so continuous. Tolerating overlap. So in some countries, in some languages, it is absolutely acceptable to overlap, to interrupt, to speak while somebody else is speaking, and it's not rude or showing impatience or something. It simply shows engagement and interest. So tolerating that. important. Being comfortable with silence, because in other cultures, silence is actually a part of communication, might show respect. I'm thinking about what you just said. Um, yeah, being very aware of the idioms that you use. And this is crucial, not mistaking linguistic ability for professional ability. So just because someone's English is a little bit slow, maybe not the best vocabulary, doesn't mean that they aren't actually really, really good at their job. So patience, bearing with them, all really important. When it comes to the non-native speakers, what would you say is important for them? Again, in the chat box, what's important for non-native speakers to do when communicating with a native speaker? And I can see some people typing. Yeah, tell the native person if they're speaking too quickly. Make sure you understand, ask questions. Do not be embarrassed to ask questions. Ask for clarity if needed. Ask questions to ensure understanding. Be brave and ask questions. Absolutely. Do not pretend to understand. I see that so many times, especially if the native speaker just asks closed questions such as, do you understand what I mean? In a lot of cultures, people will just nod and say, yes, because partly it's also a loss of face, maybe to people to admit that their English isn't as good as they'd like it to be. But if you pretend to understand, then you end up in no end of trouble because you might be going away with some actions from a meeting which you haven't actually fully understood. So, not pretending that you've understood. Absolutely, Fabio. Don't be embarrassed to show you don't understand. Very good. That's exactly that point. Very, very important. Ask those questions. Many of you mentioned that. Ask the speaker to slow down. Summarize to ensure understanding. And what you could also do would be to make sure things are followed up in writing, because that is another stage at which to check to make absolutely sure that everybody has the same level of understanding. Good. Quickly moving on to the final point. Um, so an important aspect of working internationally, of course, is to be working in international teams. And a truly culturally competent person would do a number of things before working in an international team. And I'll just show you very quickly what some of those preparatory steps could be before we then conclude the session and move on to questions. So working in international teams, of course, is the sort of subject that could easily fill a whole day or two. But I just want to leave you with a few practical preparatory steps which could be very, very useful for this area. So establishing the communication needs of everybody in the team. How frequently do people want to communicate? Every day, once a week, once a month? That there are some cultural elements to this. Clarifying the expectations of everybody in the team. What do they expect of a leader? There's a lot of research showing that expectations of what is a good leader across different cultures vary significantly. So making that a topic, exploring that, clarifying that, absolutely crucial before you start working in an international team. Define the purpose of the team. What are we here to do? Make sure that we've defined that together so everybody has a sense of ownership. Defining key concepts. We're throwing these terms around like transparency, accountability, long term plans. If you ask people to write down the definition of that across a team of 10 people from different countries, you would probably end up with 10 different definitions. So defining that for your team, absolutely crucial. Same empowerment, level of direction. How independently are we going to work? What level of direction do we expect from our leader? So hopefully you then establish a joint team culture with which the members can identify because they've all had some input into this. So just sort of the first insight into that whole area of working in international teams, which can be a crucial part of cultural competence. So we established at the very beginning that cultural competence is all about knowledge, it's about skills, and it's about attitudes, and it's about you developing your own cultural toolbox with certain ways of working, certain communication styles, which you can use for different cultural settings, different groups. So I really like this idea of the toolbox, which is specifically yours for your job, the situations that you find yourself in. So, to quickly summarize this, in order to be culturally competent, um, it's important to acquire the appropriate levels of knowledge about relevant cultures. Pick the ones you'll be dealing with, get as much knowledge as you can using all sorts of different sources and resources. Adopt the right attitudes, such as self awareness, a non judgmental approach, openness, curiosity, assuming positive intent, being flexible, adaptable, and resilient, and develop the right skills. And we've touched upon some of these, not all of these, there are plenty more. We looked at some very practical skills for analyzing situations, like the ladder of inference and the dive model. We looked at communication skills. We looked a bit at international teams, but there are also building relationships and leadership skills. So a whole host of skills which are part of your overall cultural competence. So now we're pretty much at the end of what we have prepared for you. And I'd like to hand back to Kathy just to moderate any questions which there might be.
A short amount of time together, but I feel like we've covered a huge amount of time in the hour. So thank you. We do have a few minutes left. So if anyone would like to ask a question, then please, in the usual way, put it in chat, and then we'll do our best to respond.
I like the fact some people are typing in German now. I'm most impressed.
Excellent. I think there are a couple just coming through. Perhaps while you're typing, I'll just very quickly draw your attention to a couple of events we have forthcoming. If you are interested in this topic, we have a full day course that we run on a regular basis here in West London. So that will give you a much greater level of input than the short time we've had together. And then our next webinar taking place next month is on international negotiation. So the invite will be coming round soon for that. But I can see a question has come through from Katerina. Thank you. So there's a question, Heike, do you think competence is enough, or should people develop a global or multicultural identity? Great question.
That is a great question, but I think it's actually a very personal one. I think that having the right competence, i.e., the right um, attitudes and approaches to people, is probably the more important aspect of that. Identity is such a personal question. Um, I sometimes come across people who are really striving to develop something like a global identity, and therefore they're rejecting a lot of what was in their own history, their own personal development. So it almost feels a little bit artificial.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that as you work internationally, you travel, you work in different cultures, your identity grows and slightly changes. But I don't think you're necessarily developing a separate new thing. It's part of who you are, of your own identity, which includes your past, your history, your development.
Yep, no, I think that makes sense. And I think, again, it's such a big question, isn't it? Perhaps, again, that's a topic for a future webinar looking at multicultural identity. Any last questions? I know we are more or less out of time. Well, if anyone does have questions, please feel free to forward them through to us. I'll just put up our contact details, all the usual social media. If you have any questions, feel free to fire them across by email. And otherwise, we'll say goodbye and hopefully we'll see you on the next webinar next month. And thank you once again to Heike. It's been a great session and I hope everyone's enjoyed it. So thank you and see you next time.